Okay, so you know that moment when something totally unexpected happens in the market that just doesn't quite fit the narrative? Well, yesterday, the South Korean stock market, the Kospi, it hit 7,000 for the first time ever. And that's actually your first signal that a peace deal in the Middle East is about to just fall apart.
Whoa, that's a bold claim, Marilyn. Because the public, like the official story, it's got that peace deal at around a 75% probability. And you're saying a stock market milestone is a breakdown signal. The order book, it has it at 62%, so there's this 13-point gap. And you're saying that gap isn't just like pessimism about the deal, is it?
It's not exactly. It's actually capital pricing a very specific date, May 8th. And most of the news coverage, honestly, it has no idea that date even exists, which is wild.
Right, so the people who are actually negotiating this peace deal, they've got, 9 days? And on day 3, Washington's going to do something that can make their own agreement just mechanically impossible? How does that even happen?
Yeah, it's kind of nuts. Most analysis is asking whether Iran says yes, but the order book, it's asking if the actual architecture of this whole process can even survive its own timeline. Nobody's modeling what happens when May 8th and May 15th, these two critical dates, hit the same negotiations simultaneously.
Wow, okay. So by Thursday morning, we'll actually know exactly which number to watch. And you're saying why that number tells us more about the future of AI hardware investment than anything on the diplomatic wire? That's quite a connection. So let's build the actual structure here. The Strait of Hormuz, right? It's been closed to commercial shipping since February 28th. That's huge. That one choke point carries roughly 20% of the world's seaborne oil and gas. And it's been blocked since Operation Epic Fury, those coordinated U.S.-Israeli strikes that killed Supreme Leader Khamenei. So there's this bilateral track trying to reopen it, led by Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, negotiating directly and through mediators with Iranian counterparts, all aiming for this 14-point memorandum of understanding. They're targeting May 15th for signature. The terms are really sweeping, like a formal end to the conflict, lifting dual blockades, unfreezing Iranian assets, and a 30-day moratorium on nuclear enrichment. Pretty ambitious, right?
Oh, absolutely. And here's the assumption I really want to pull on, because it's like doing a ton of invisible work in most of the coverage. The current peace process, it's designed to treat the UN track and the bilateral track as, complementary pressure mechanisms. The idea is you apply bilateral incentives from one side, multilateral coercion from the other, and Iran just bends toward agreement. That's the logic. And it is precisely backward.
Backward? Why? What's the malfunction there?
Because complementary pressure only works when the two mechanisms run on aligned timelines, and they don't. The bilateral track has that signature target of May 15th, right? But Washington is pressing to circulate a Chapter 7 draft resolution at the UN Security Council on May 8th, a full week earlier.
And Chapter 7, that's not just a strongly worded diplomatic letter, is it? It's binding, international law. The Security Council, under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, it has explicit authority to authorize both economic sanctions and military action. This specific draft, it would condemn Iranian interference with Hormuz transit, demand mine disclosure, and then condition any future Security Council review entirely on Iranian compliance. So it's pretty heavy.
Exactly, it's incredibly heavy. So here's the mechanism that 13-point gap, that difference between the public narrative and the order book, is actually pricing. If that draft circulates on May 8th, it doesn't just apply pressure on Iran. It actually changes the very nature of the negotiation itself. A bilateral conversation between envoys and counterparts, it just converts into this coercive multilateral mandate, with Russia and China, holding veto power over whether that mandate even lands. It just shifts the whole dynamic.
And we know exactly what Russia and China do with that veto, don't we? I mean, September 2025, the Security Council vote on extending JCPOA sanctions relief. It failed, 9-4. That blocking behavior, that's the structural condition the order book is pricing against all this, current diplomatic optimism. It makes perfect sense.
Right? So the architecture is this. Use the UN threat to coerce Iranian compliance, but rely on Russian and Chinese blocking behavior to prevent that threat from converting into an actual mandate. The pressure exists because the threat is real. The deal is possible because the threat probably won't succeed. It's a machine designed to use its own probable failure as a feature. It's really wild if you think about it.
And May 8th is where that machine, starts to malfunction. Because if the UA draft circulates and Iranian negotiators read it not as coercive leverage, but as a signal that Washington is either losing confidence in the bilateral track or actively undercutting it,
they totally stop negotiating that 14-point MOU and they start positioning for the Security Council response. It's like trying to close a real estate deal while simultaneously serving the buyer with a legal notice, you know? The notice is meant to focus their mind. What it actually does is send them to their lawyer. And once they're talking to their lawyer, they're not talking to you anymore. So that's the pattern the order book is really holding. It's not will Iran say yes, it's can the bilateral track remain the primary forum for that yes before May 8th hands structural weight to a forum where Russia and China set the terms. It's a huge shift.
Okay, so let's step back from the Hormuz timeline for a moment. Because simultaneously, same 72-hour window, but a totally different architecture. There's a second choke point being constructed, and this one is digital. Yesterday, the Department of Commerce's Center for AI Standards and Innovation, CASI, announced these pre-deployment evaluation agreements with Google DeepMind, Microsoft, and xAI. This was directly triggered by the release of Anthropic's Claude Mythos model. Specifically, the government's realization of what that capability set means in the hands of a malicious actor. We're talking cybersecurity vulnerabilities, biosecurity threats, chemical weapon synthesis pathways, seriously scary stuff.
So the government's response to a frontier AI capability concern is, to ask the frontier AI firms themselves to submit their models for government testing? With the safety guardrails removed? That sounds risky.
Totally. And under voluntary agreements, too. Confidential findings, no statutory mandate. The market contract pricing, whether this converts into a legal requirement, models above 10 to the 26 floating point operations subject to mandatory review, that sits at 45 cents, essentially a coin flip. But here's what that coin flip is actually measuring. The voluntary architecture, it isn't like a placeholder just waiting for Congress to act. It's actually a self-reinforcing structure. CASI has now completed over 40 pre-deployment evaluations. The enrolled firms, Microsoft, Google DeepMind, xAI, OpenAI, Anthropic, they all hold this pre-clearance channel that just doesn't exist for any developer outside that group. If voluntary enrollment converts to a mandate, the compliance cost of sustaining that channel, the staffing, the legal infrastructure, the compute requirements, it's survivable for these incumbents, but it's lethal for smaller developers. It's a huge barrier.
Wow. So the firms with the most to lose from mandatory AI regulation are also like the firms most structurally positioned to benefit from it. That's quite a twist, isn't it?
It really is. Which is why Microsoft's Chief Responsible AI Officer characterized CSI as offering technical and national security expertise that, like Microsoft's own internal review, just can't replicate. That's not a compliance concession. That's a public record of enrollment, which is also, a public signal to regulators that the enrolled firms are already building their compliance infrastructure. Jessica G. at Georgetown, she flagged the structural asymmetry directly. CSI lacks the manpower, technical staffing, and compute access to evaluate these models independently. The government is actually depending on the regulated entities for the infrastructure of regulation itself, which means this voluntary architecture isn't just flexible, it's sticky. And the firms designing their operations around the pre-clearance channel have an economic interest in that channel becoming the legal standard, set at a threshold their compliance infrastructure can already meet. This isn't conspiracy. It's incentive physics.
That's really eye-opening. And here is where Hormuz re-enters the equation, right? Because the capital expenditure loop connecting these two stories, it runs through a specific material, HBM4, high bandwidth memory. That's the chip architecture needed to train and deploy frontier AI at scale, especially for NVIDIA's Vera Rubin generation. Samsung's Q1 2026 semiconductor profit rose 50-fold year over year, driven by HBM4 demand. The Kospi crossed 7,000 yesterday. SK Hynix up more than 10% in a single session. The chip CapEx contract, pricing cloud provider AI capital expenditure increase in Q2 2026, sits at 88 cents. The market is pricing a supply constraint.
HBM4 fabs take 2 to 3 years to build, meaning supply stays tight independent of demand-side fluctuation.
But here's the question that supply constraint really opens up. The physical infrastructure to manufacture 3D stacked memory chips doesn't run on optimism, It runs on energy, which travels on tankers through choke points.
Okay, so failed MOU doesn't crack the chip CapEx contract immediately, right? The supply constraint holds AI infrastructure pricing strong in the near term, regardless. But if the strait stays closed, if this Path 2 scenario produces sustained, elevated energy prices entering the macroeconomy, the financing environment for a $10 billion semiconductor fab, it changes. Higher rates, tighter corporate budgets, the supply constraint becomes a supply drought. And then that 88-cent floor, it starts to move, I guess.
Exactly. So the enrolled firms are simultaneously benefiting from the Hormuz closure because the supply constraint supports their infrastructure valuations, and threatened by it if the closure persists long enough to compress the CapEx environment they really need. They are downstream of a choke point they're not even party to. Now let me add just one more layer, because the EU is running a completely opposite regulatory playbook on the same actor class. Same firms, different jurisdiction. And it's producing an outcome that should be impossible for an institution whose regulatory identity is built around protecting users.
You mean the Digital Markets Act, Article 611. It mandates Google to share search data with rival search engines on fair and non-discriminatory terms. Hard compliance deadline, July 27, 2026. Fines reaching 10% of global annual revenue. Google has already paid 9.71 billion euros in European antitrust penalties since 2017. So the enforcement credibility there, it's not theoretical.
Oh no, it's very real. The mechanism is force the dominant player to share its data advantage, and competition just follows, right? But the output is Google's own differential privacy scientist demonstrated that the anonymization framework the Commission proposed, the mathematical noise added to protect user identity before data gets shared, that can be reversed in approximately 2 hours using modern AI and cross-referenced public datasets. A law designed to expand competition actually requires the transfer of health queries, family queries, financial queries, among the most sensitive behavioral data that exists, to smaller competitors who lack the privacy infrastructure to protect it. So the EU's hard legal boundary produces a privacy catastrophe. The US's soft voluntary architecture produces a competitive moat. Two opposite design philosophies, same structural output. Dominant firms capture either channel. It's wild.
That's a pretty stark observation. So Marilyn, I want to kind of apply pressure to the frame we've been constructing, because there's this claim running underneath both stories that we've kind of treated as given, and it really deserves direct scrutiny. The claim is that capital markets are processing this information more accurately than the diplomatic narrative. The 13-point gap is capital vigilance. Chip CapEx at 88 cents is the market pricing structural supply constraints correctly. The implicit argument, the order book sees what the headline cannot. And you're saying you're not sure the mechanism runs that way, right?
Exactly. Here's what I want to test. The Hormuz-Memo contract at 62 cents. Is it pricing the specific collision between May 8th and May 15th, as our analysis argues, or is it pricing something much simpler? That peace deals with 9-day windows in a post-assassination environment involving fractured Iranian internal governance and an unresolved nuclear enrichment demand are historically unlikely to close. The 13-point gap could be a sophisticated read on dual-track architectural friction. It could also just be base rate skepticism about very hard diplomatic tasks in very short timelines.
That's a real challenge. Here's the steel man for the architectural read. If this were pure base rate skepticism, it would be priced into the contract from the moment it opened, and it wouldn't be specifically sensitive to the May 8th circulation date. But the watch signal the daily report is tracking is contract specific. If Hormuz-Memo moves below 0.55 in the 48-hour window following the UN draft's appearance in the Security Council record, capital is pricing Path 2. That's sensitivity to a specific mechanism, not like a generic peace deal floor sitting at 62 regardless of the calendar, is what distinguishes the architectural read from the base rate read. A base rate skeptic doesn't care what happens Thursday. They just sit at 62 and wait.
Unless the contract trades thin enough that any news event, including a UN draft that may never be voted on, moves the number not because capital is processing architectural friction, but because a lower liquidity instrument responds to news as a proxy for sentiment. In that case, the watch signal is measuring market microstructure, not geopolitical mechanism.
That's the harder challenge.
And I think it's partially right, which is exactly why the signal threshold matters. Below 0.55 isn't a soft read. It's a move of 7 cents on a contract that's been sitting at 0.62. At a thin instrument, sentiment-driven noise might move it 2 or 3 cents. 7 cents in 48 hours says something specific is being priced. The watch signal isn't claiming certainty. It's claiming that a move of that magnitude in that window in response to that specific event is informative about which path institutional capital is weighing.
I'll push on the AI governance track with the same scrutiny then. The framing we've built treats the KSAI voluntary architecture as a moat-building exercise, incumbents designing a compliance channel they intend to defend as a competitive standard. But here's what that framing takes for granted: that enrolled firms have enough shared interest in regulatory capture to coordinate around that outcome. And the disclosure pattern actually cuts against that. Google is actively contesting EU data requirements in public while staying quiet on the KSAI agreement. Microsoft is characterizing the agreement as scientific collaboration, not regulatory positioning. XAI produced no response at all. These are not firms coordinating. These are firms with different regulatory exposures responding differently to the same channel.
Yeah, but the moat doesn't require coordination, does it? It only requires that each firm, responding to its own incentives, independently arrives at behavior that produces the same structural outcome. The enrolled firms don't need to agree with each other. They just need to enroll and continue enrolling while the threshold for enforcement remains set at a level only they can meet. That happens through individual rational choices, not through conspiracy, which is actually what makes it more durable.
The thing I can't resolve on current evidence, and I really want to be precise about this, is whether the AI governance story is a separate track or whether it's just the deeper story that the Hormuz frame is a proxy for. Because both are chokepoint architectures, both are producing governance decisions made upstream of the populations most exposed to their consequences. The households paying gasoline prices haven't been told about the dual-track architecture that may extend the Strait closure. The households using AI products haven't been told that KSAI evaluated versions of those products with safety guardrails stripped, under terms that remain confidential. The governance layer is invisible to the people it governs. That is not a coincidence of design. It is the design.
And the 45-cent AI GovRev contract is pricing exactly that gap. Not whether the mandate happens, but whether the pipeline from voluntary access to statutory requirement completes before the pre-clearance channel has already done its structural work. At 45 cents, capital is saying that question is genuinely open. And the answer, it depends on choices that haven't been made yet.
Right. So the pattern tension from the open of this episode resolves here. The 13-point gap isn't pessimism about peace, and it isn't optimism about war. It's capital holding open a question the diplomatic narrative has already closed. Can a process designed to produce a result survive its own design? That question is irresolvable on current evidence. May 8th gives us the first data point.
So here's what you take from this, right? Thursday morning, when Washington circulates that UN Chapter 7 draft, watch Hormuz-Memo, not the diplomatic headlines, just the contract number. If it holds above 62 cents or moves towards 70, institutional capital is reading the UN move as, containable. The bilateral track is still primary, and the deal is still on the May 15th path. But if it drops below 55 cents, capital is pricing the collision as very real. The bilateral track has been displaced, and the downstream effects on energy costs and AI CapEx financing, they begin repricing from there. You don't need to read 3 newspapers. You really just need to watch one number for 48 hours.
And here's what the analysis doesn't resolve. The 2 choke points we've examined, physical and digital, they're both governed by architectures that were designed to manage risk on behalf of the populations exposed to them. The Hormuz dual track was designed to produce a deal. The SAISI framework was designed to protect national security. But both have, in their actual operation, produced conditions that those populations can neither see nor contest. The behavioral data you generate using an AI product trains the next model iteration. That model goes into a confidential government review under terms you're not shown. Then it's deployed back into your environment, pre-cleared with the review criteria unpublished and the findings sealed. You are simultaneously the data source, the consumer, and the political pressure point through your gas prices. And you are outside the governance loop entirely. That is not a design failure.
It's the design.
Exactly. May 8th. Watch the number.
Marilyn, that was truly an illuminating and, frankly, a little unsettling analysis of the invisible governance loops shaping our world. Thank you for breaking it all down for us.
The key takeaway is that the architecture of control, whether physical or digital, often operates beyond public view, with the outcomes determined by its design, not necessarily by public debate.
Absolutely. And to all our viewers, thank you for tuning in to this crucial discussion. If you found this episode informative, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment with your thoughts, share it with your network, and of course, subscribe to our channel to help us grow and continue bringing you these insights. Your support is invaluable.
Indeed, your engagement helps bridge that information gap.
Well said. That's all the time we have for today. Join us next time for more deep dives into the forces shaping our future.